Number 1. The day 120,000 Japanese Americans lost their freedom. History remembers the battles of World War II, but one of its most troubling stories happened far from the front lines. In the name of national security, an entire community was stripped of its rights without ever being charged with a crime. After Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, fear spread rapidly across the United States. Political pressure, wartime panic, and racial prejudice combined to create a dangerous atmosphere. In February 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, allowing the forced removal of people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. More than 120,000 Japanese Americans were uprooted from their homes. About two-thirds were U.S. citizens. Families lost businesses, farms, savings, and property as they were sent to remote incarceration camps surrounded by fences and armed guards. No evidence ever showed that Japanese Americans as a group posed a security threat. One of the most famous legal challenges came from Fred Korematsu, who resisted the order. Yet the U.S. Supreme Court initially upheld the government's actions. The camps remained open for years. When the war ended, many families returned to find their lives shattered and their communities transformed. Decades later, the U.S. government formally acknowledged the injustice. In 1988, Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act, issuing an official apology and compensation to surviving detainees. The story still matters because it reveals how fear can overwhelm constitutional rights. It stands as a warning that in times of crisis, protecting freedom can be just as important as protecting security. The legacy of Japanese American internment is not only a chapter of wartime history, it is a reminder of how easily democracy can fail when prejudice and panic take control. Number 2. The Armenian Genocide. The campaign that tried to erase a people. History remembers the great battles of World War I, but while the world's attention was fixed on the front lines, a catastrophe was unfolding inside the Ottoman Empire. It would become one of the deadliest persecutions of the 20th century and leave a scar that remains controversial even today. For centuries, Armenians had lived throughout the Ottoman Empire as a Christian minority. As the empire weakened and nationalist tensions grew, some leaders began to view Armenians as a threat, especially after the outbreak of World War I in 1914. On April 24, 1915, Ottoman authorities arrested hundreds of Armenian intellectuals, community leaders, and clergy. Historians widely regard this date as the beginning of the Armenian Genocide. Over the following years, Armenians were deported from their homes, forced into deadly marches across the Syrian desert, and subjected to mass killings, starvation, and disease. In some regions, Armenian volunteer units and local defense groups fought back, attempting to protect civilians and resist deportations. Their resistance became a symbol of survival in the face of overwhelming odds. Most historians estimate that between 800,000 and 1.5 million Armenians died between 1915 and 1923. Survivors scattered across the world, creating a vast Armenian diaspora stretching from the Middle East to Europe and the Americas. The genocide transformed the Armenian nation forever. Entire communities disappeared, ancient cultural centers were destroyed, and generations grew up far from their ancestral homeland. Today, the Armenian Genocide remains a powerful reminder of how state-sponsored persecution can escalate into mass atrocity. More than a century later, the struggle for remembrance continues, proving that history is not only about what happened, but also about whether the world chooses to remember it. Number 3. The Day. A swimming pool became a civil rights battleground. In the summer of 1964, as America claimed to be the leader of the free world, a shocking scene unfolded beside a motel swimming pool in Florida. What happened that day exposed the ugly reality of racial segregation and became one of the defining images of the civil rights movement. By the 1960s, segregation was under attack across the United States. African Americans were challenging discriminatory laws through marches, sit-ins, and peaceful protests. Yet many public facilities, including hotels, restaurants, and swimming pools, still excluded black citizens. On June 18, 1964, civil rights activists entered the swimming pool at the Monson Motor Lodge in St. Augustine, Florida, to protest segregation. The demonstration was part of a larger campaign led by activists working alongside Martin Luther King Jr. and local organizers. As protesters entered the water, motel manager James Brock responded by pouring muriatic acid into the pool. Although the acid was diluted and did not seriously injure the swimmers, the act stunned witnesses and photographers. Images of the incident quickly spread across newspapers and television screens nationwide. The protest occurred during a critical moment in American history. Congress was debating the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, legislation designed to outlaw racial discrimination in public accommodations. The photographs from St. Augustine helped reveal the intensity of resistance to integration and strengthened public support for civil rights reform. Less than 3 weeks later, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. Today, the Monson Motor Lodge protest remains a powerful reminder that historic change is often driven by ordinary people willing to confront injustice in public view. One swimming pool became more than a place of recreation. It became a battlefield in the struggle for equality, helping push a nation closer to its founding promise that all citizens deserve equal rights under the law. Number 4. The case that helped destroy segregation in American education. Long before the famous Supreme Court ruling that ended school segregation, one man quietly challenged a system designed to keep Black Americans separate and unequal. His name was George McLaurin, and his fight would help change the future of civil rights in the United States. In 1948, George McLaurin, a retired educator, sought admission to the University of Oklahoma to pursue a doctorate in education. Oklahoma law at the time prohibited Black and white students from attending the same schools. McLaurin took his case to court, arguing that he was being denied equal educational opportunities. A federal court ordered the university to admit him, but even after admission, segregation remained. McLaurin was forced to sit apart from white students in classrooms, eat at separate tables, and use designated spaces within the university. He could attend lectures, but he was deliberately isolated from the academic community around him. Refusing to accept this treatment, McLaurin challenged the university again. His case reached the U.S. Supreme Court as McLaurin versus Oklahoma State Regents. In 1950, the court unanimously ruled that the university's segregation policies violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment because they impaired his ability to learn, study, and exchange ideas with fellow students. The decision became a major legal blow against the doctrine of separate but equal. Alongside other landmark cases, it laid the groundwork for the historic Brown versus Board of Education ruling 4 years later, which declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional. George McLaurin's struggle was about more than a seat in a classroom. It proved that equality is not simply access to a building, it is the right to participate fully and equally in society. His victory helped dismantle a system of segregation and brought the United States one step closer to fulfilling its promise of equal justice under the law. Number 5. 9/11, the day that changed the world forever. On a clear September morning in 2001, millions of people began their day expecting nothing unusual. Within hours, the United States would suffer the deadliest terrorist attack in its history, and the world would enter a new era defined by war, security fears, and global uncertainty. The attacks were planned by the extremist organization Al-Qaeda under the leadership of Osama bin Laden. 19 hijackers seized 4 commercial airliners on September 11, 2001. 2 planes crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York. A third struck the Pentagon near Washington, D.C. The fourth, believed to be headed toward another major target, crashed in Shanksville after passengers fought back against the hijackers. The destruction was unprecedented. Nearly 3,000 people from more than 90 countries were killed. Thousands more were injured, and countless first responders rushed into danger to save lives. Rescue teams worked around the clock in the ruins, searching for survivors and recovering victims. The attacks triggered profound consequences. The United States launched the War on Terror, beginning with military operations in Afghanistan. Security measures changed dramatically worldwide, from airport screening procedures to intelligence gathering and international counterterrorism cooperation. The impact extended far beyond politics and warfare. Families lost loved ones, entire communities mourned, and many survivors and emergency workers faced long-term health effects from exposure to toxic debris. More than 2 decades later, 9/11 remains one of the most significant events of the modern era. It reshaped foreign policy, altered global security strategies, and influenced international relations for generations. History is often measured by turning points. September 11th was one of those moments, a single morning that transformed the course of the 21st century and left a legacy the world is still grappling with today. Number 6. The Nazi program that stole hundreds of thousands of children. When people think of Nazi crimes during World War II, they often think of concentration camps, mass executions, and genocide. But one of the regime's most disturbing programs targeted children, taking them from their families and attempting to erase their identities forever. As Nazi Germany expanded across Europe, its leaders became obsessed with racial ideology. Under a program linked to the SS and the organization known as Lebensborn, officials searched occupied territories for children who matched their vision of racially valuable traits. Thousands of children, particularly from Poland, were taken from their homes. Many were separated from parents who never saw them again. The children underwent examinations and classification procedures. Those deemed suitable were given German names, taught the German language, and placed with German families or institutions. Their original identities, cultures, and family histories were deliberately erased. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of Polish children alone were abducted, while the total number affected across occupied Europe may have reached into the hundreds of thousands. Many families desperately searched for their children after the war, often finding little documentation and few clues. When Nazi Germany collapsed in 1945, Allied investigators uncovered evidence of the kidnapping program. International efforts were launched to identify the children and reunite them with surviving relatives. Some were successfully returned, but many had become so disconnected from their origins that reunification proved difficult or impossible. The consequences lasted for generations. Survivors struggled with questions of identity, belonging, and loss. Families were left with unanswered questions about children who had vanished during the war. Today, the Nazi child abduction program stands as a chilling reminder that genocide is not only about killing people. It can also involve destroying cultures, families, and identities. The stolen children of Europe remain one of the most haunting and lesser-known victims of the Nazi regime's attempt to reshape an entire continent according to its racial ideology. Number 7. When American citizens came home to hate, the dark legacy of Japanese internment. World War II ended with celebrations across America. Soldiers returned home as heroes, victory parades filled the streets, and the nation looked toward the future. But for thousands of Japanese American families, coming home meant facing a different kind of battle. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, fear and prejudice swept across the United States. In 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the forced removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. More than 120,000 people were sent to incarceration camps scattered across remote regions of the country. Nearly two-thirds were American citizens. Families were forced to abandon homes, businesses, farms, and possessions. Many sold everything they owned for a fraction of its value. Behind barbed wire, they lived for years under government supervision despite no evidence of widespread espionage or sabotage. As the war drew to a close, the camps began to shut down. Families returned, expecting to rebuild their lives. Instead, many found their property vandalized, stolen, or occupied. Some were greeted with threats, hostility, and signs declaring that they were not welcome. Years of work and savings had vanished. The injustice eventually became impossible to ignore. In 1988, the U.S. government formally acknowledged that the internment had been driven by race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Survivors received an official apology and compensation through the Civil Liberties Act. The story remains one of the most significant civil liberties failures in American history. It demonstrates how fear can strip citizens of their rights and how difficult it can be to restore what has been lost. More than a wartime mistake, Japanese internment serves as a warning for every generation. When a nation allows suspicion and prejudice to override justice, even its own citizens can become victims of their government. Number 8. Chernobyl. The night. A nuclear reactor exploded. In the early hours of April 26, 1986, a routine safety test at a Soviet nuclear power plant went catastrophically wrong. Within seconds, a reactor exploded, releasing massive amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere and triggering the worst nuclear disaster in human history. The accident occurred at reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant near the city of Pripyat. Operators were conducting a test designed to determine whether the reactor could continue producing power during an emergency shutdown. A combination of design flaws in the RBMK reactor and critical operator errors caused an uncontrollable power surge. 2 explosions tore through the reactor building. The reactor core was exposed, and radioactive fuel, graphite, and debris were blasted into the air. Firefighters rushed to the scene, unaware of the extreme radiation levels. Many received lethal doses while battling the fires that threatened to spread the disaster further. For nearly 2 days, Soviet authorities delayed informing the public about the scale of the catastrophe. Meanwhile, radioactive contamination spread across large areas of Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and much of Europe. More than 100,000 people were eventually evacuated from the surrounding region, many never returning home. In the months that followed, hundreds of thousands of workers, known as liquidators, were mobilized to contain the disaster, remove contaminated material, and construct a massive concrete shelter around the destroyed reactor. The consequences were immense. Entire communities were abandoned. Vast areas became exclusion zones, and the disaster intensified global concerns about nuclear safety. The accident also exposed deep flaws in Soviet secrecy and contributed to growing public distrust of the government. Nearly 4 decades later, Chernobyl remains a symbol of how technological failures, human error, and political secrecy can combine to create a catastrophe with consequences lasting generations. The ruins of reactor number 4 stand as a warning that some mistakes can change the course of history in a single night. Number 9, Auschwitz and the Final Solution, the deadliest factory of death in history. In the summer of 1944, trains arrived at a place that had become the center of Nazi Germany's campaign to annihilate Europe's Jews. For many passengers, the journey ended within hours. They had no idea they were entering the deadliest killing center ever created. The story begins with the Holocaust, the systematic genocide carried out by Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler during World War II. Driven by racist and anti-Semitic ideology, the Nazi regime sought to eliminate Jewish communities across Europe. What began with discrimination and persecution escalated into mass murder on an industrial scale. Auschwitz, located in occupied Poland, became the largest concentration and extermination camp in the Nazi system. In 1944, after Germany occupied Hungary, nearly 440,000 Hungarian Jews were deported in just a few months. Most were transported directly to Auschwitz to Birkenau. Upon arrival, SS officers conducted selections. A small number were chosen for forced labor. The majority, including many children, elderly people, and mothers with young families, were sent directly to gas chambers. Victims were murdered using Zyklon B, and their bodies were burned in crematoria designed to handle mass killings. By the time Soviet forces liberated Auschwitz in January 1945, approximately 1.1 million people had been murdered there, the overwhelming majority of them Jews. Across Europe, the Holocaust claimed the lives of roughly 6 million Jews, along with millions of other victims persecuted by the Nazi regime. The Holocaust transformed international law and human rights. The horrors uncovered after the war led to the Nuremberg trials, the adoption of the Genocide Convention, and a global commitment, however imperfect, to prevent such crimes from happening again. Auschwitz remains one of history's starkest warnings. It shows how prejudice, propaganda, and unchecked state power can evolve into catastrophe. Remembering its victims is not only about the past, it is a responsibility to protect human dignity in the present and future. Number 10. Hiroshima, 8:15 a.m., the minute the nuclear age began. At 8:15 on the morning of August 6, 1945, history changed in an instant. In less than a second, a single weapon unleashed a level of destruction the world had never witnessed before, marking the beginning of the nuclear age. By the summer of 1945, World War II had raged for nearly 6 years. Nazi Germany had surrendered, but Japan continued to fight despite devastating losses. Seeking a rapid end to the war, the United States turned to a secret project that had consumed billions of dollars and involved some of the world's leading scientists, the Manhattan Project. On August 6th, the American B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb known as Little Boy over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The explosion released energy equivalent to approximately 15,000 tons of TNT. Temperatures near the blast reached extraordinary levels, and a massive shockwave swept through the city. An estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people were killed almost immediately. By the end of 1945, deaths from burns, injuries, and radiation exposure had pushed the toll far higher. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb struck Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender, bringing World War II to an end. The bombings remain among the most debated events in modern history. Supporters argue they helped end the war and avoided a costly invasion of Japan. Critics contend that the human cost was too great and question whether alternatives existed. What is beyond dispute is the legacy. Hiroshima transformed warfare, international politics, and scientific responsibility forever. The city became a global symbol of both the horrors of nuclear weapons and the urgent need to prevent their use. The stopped clocks, shattered buildings, and survivors' testimonies all point to the same moment, 8:15 a.m., when humanity entered an age in which a single bomb could change the fate of the world.
Number 11. The second atomic bomb that changed the world forever. August 9th, 1945, just 3 days after the destruction of Hiroshima, another Japanese city awoke expecting an ordinary morning. Factory workers headed to their jobs, children prepared for school, families began their daily routines. Then, at 11:02 a.m., a blinding flash brighter than the sun erupted above the city of Nagasaki. In a single instant, tens of thousands of lives were changed forever. The world had just witnessed the second, and so far last, use of an atomic weapon in war. This is the story of the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. By the summer of 1945, World War II was nearing its end. In Europe, Nazi Germany had already surrendered. But in the Pacific, Japan continued fighting despite devastating losses. American leaders feared that a full-scale invasion of Japan could cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. At the same time, the United States had completed one of the most secret scientific projects in history, the Manhattan Project. The result was a weapon unlike anything humanity had ever seen. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb used in warfare detonated over Hiroshima. The destruction shocked the world. Yet Japan's government had not immediately surrendered. American military planners prepared to deploy a second bomb. The next target was initially another city, but weather conditions forced a change of plans. That change would seal Nagasaki's fate. On the morning of August 9th, a B-29 bomber named Boxcar took off carrying a plutonium bomb known as Fat Man. The mission faced delays, fuel concerns, and cloud cover. For a time, it seemed the attack might be abandoned. But shortly before noon, a break in the clouds appeared over Nagasaki. The bomb was released. 43 seconds later, the world changed again. The explosion unleashed energy equivalent to roughly 21,000 tons of TNT. A massive fireball formed in the sky. Buildings collapsed, homes vanished, factories were obliterated. A shockwave tore through valleys and neighborhoods. Thousands died instantly. Many more suffered severe injuries and radiation exposure. Unlike Hiroshima's relatively flat terrain, Nagasaki's hills helped limit some of the blast's reach. Yet the devastation remained catastrophic. Entire communities disappeared within moments. The true tragedy cannot be measured only in numbers. Parents searched desperately for children. Children searched for parents who would never return. Survivors emerged into a landscape almost beyond recognition. Many who appeared unharmed initially later became sick from radiation. Years afterward, survivors continued to battle illness, trauma, and loss. These survivors became known as hibakusha, people affected by the atomic bombings. Their testimonies remain some of the most powerful warnings about nuclear warfare ever recorded. Just 6 days after Nagasaki's destruction, Japan announced its surrender. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation. For the first time, many Japanese citizens heard their emperor's voice. The war was over. The deadliest conflict in human history had finally come to an end. Even decades later, historians continue debating whether the atomic bombings were necessary. Some argue the attacks prevented an even bloodier invasion. Others believe alternatives existed that could have avoided such immense civilian suffering. The discussion remains one of the most important and controversial questions in modern history. What is beyond dispute is the scale of human loss. The bombing of Nagasaki permanently altered the course of global politics, warfare, and scientific responsibility.
The water fountain that exposed a nation. The story of Jim Crow segregation. Imagine being told that the water you drink, the school you attend, the bus seat you occupy, and even the restroom you use are determined solely by the color of your skin. Not because of who you are or what you've done, but because a system was designed to remind you every day that you were considered unequal. For millions of African Americans in the United States, this wasn't distant history. It was everyday life, and one of the most powerful symbols of that reality was something as ordinary as a drinking fountain. This is the story of Jim Crow segregation, a system that shaped generations, fueled one of the greatest civil rights struggles in history, and changed America forever. In 1865, the American Civil War ended and slavery was abolished. Many believed a new era of freedom and equality had begun. For a brief period, African Americans voted, held public office, and participated in political life. However, that progress soon faced fierce resistance. Across the southern United States, state governments began creating laws designed to separate black and white citizens. These laws became known as Jim Crow laws. Their purpose was clear: to maintain racial hierarchy while denying African Americans equal opportunities and rights. The system gained legal support in 1896 through the Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson. The court ruled that racial segregation was constitutional as long as facilities were considered separate, but equal. In reality, they were rarely equal. Black schools received fewer resources, public services were neglected, and hospitals, libraries, transportation systems, and recreational facilities were divided by race. Signs marked white and colored became common throughout much of the South. They appeared at train stations, restaurants, theaters, waiting rooms, and drinking fountains, serving as constant reminders of institutionalized discrimination. Segregation affected nearly every aspect of daily life. African Americans faced significant barriers when attempting to vote. including literacy tests, poll taxes, intimidation, and violence. Economic opportunities were restricted, trapping many communities in cycles of poverty. Beyond the laws themselves existed an atmosphere of fear. Those who challenged the system risked losing their jobs, being arrested, or becoming targets of racial violence. For countless families, survival meant learning how to navigate a society built on inequality. Despite these obstacles, segregation did not go unchallenged. African American communities organized, educated, protested, and fought back. Lawyers challenged discriminatory laws in court, journalists exposed injustice, and churches became centers of resistance and leadership. A major turning point came in 1954, when the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that segregated public schools were inherently unequal. The legal foundation of Jim Crow had begun to crack. The struggle intensified throughout the 1950s and 1960s as ordinary citizens carried out extraordinary acts of courage. Students organized sit-ins, families joined boycotts, and activists marched despite threats, arrests, and violence. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, along with thousands of lesser-known organizers, transformed a growing movement into a force that could no longer be ignored. Television cameras brought scenes of segregation and brutality into homes across America, allowing the nation and the world to witness the reality of racial injustice. As public awareness grew, so did pressure for change. In 1964, a landmark victory arrived with the Civil Rights Act, which outlawed many forms of racial segregation and discrimination. 1 year later, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 targeted barriers that had long prevented African Americans from voting. The legal structure of Jim Crow began to collapse, and the signs that once separated people by race gradually disappeared. Yet the effects of decades of discrimination did not vanish overnight. Many challenges remained, and some continue to be debated today. To modern eyes, an old colored drinking fountain may seem like a relic from another era, yet it represents something much larger. It symbolizes a time when inequality was written into law, when millions of people were denied basic dignity, and when ordinary citizens risked everything to demand justice. History is often remembered through wars, presidents, and famous speeches, but sometimes it is remembered through a simple object, a water fountain, a sign, or a photograph. These objects remind us how far a society can fall and how hard people must fight to change it. Number 13. The Day a Ku Klux Klan Rally exposed America's unfinished struggle with racism. Gainesville, 1992. History is often remembered through wars, elections, and famous speeches, but sometimes a single moment at a small-town protest reveals a much larger story about an entire nation. In 1992, members of the Ku Klux Klan gathered in Gainesville, Georgia, to hold a public rally. The Klan, a white supremacist organization with roots stretching back to the aftermath of the American Civil War, had spent generations promoting racial segregation, intimidation, and violence. Their presence drew protesters, community leaders, journalists, and law enforcement, turning the event into a flashpoint in America's ongoing struggle over race. The rally took place during a period when the United States was still confronting the legacy of the Civil Rights Movement and debating how far the country had truly progressed. Police were deployed to prevent clashes between demonstrators and Klan supporters. Images from the event spread widely, becoming symbols of the stark contrast between the ideals of equality and the persistence of racial hatred. The Klan itself had lost much of its political power by the late 20th century, but rallies like this demonstrated that extremist ideologies had not disappeared. Public opposition to the group was strong, and community resistance helped isolate its message. The consequences reached beyond one day in Georgia. The event became part of a broader national conversation about racism, free speech, public protest, and reconciliation. Decades later, it remains a reminder that prejudice can survive long after laws change. The story of Gainesville is not simply about one rally. It is about the continuing challenge of building a society where equality is defended not only in law, but in everyday life. Number 14. The Hero Dogs of 9/11, the search for survivors beneath the Twin Towers. On September 11, 2001, as the world watched the Twin Towers collapse, another battle began in the ruins below. It was a race against time to find survivors buried beneath millions of tons of steel, concrete, and dust. After the terrorist attacks carried out by Al-Qaeda, more than 2,900 people lost their lives in New York, Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania. In the hours that followed, hundreds of rescue workers rushed to Ground Zero. Among them were specially trained search and rescue dogs. These dogs came from emergency response teams across the United States. Guided by their handlers, they climbed unstable mountains of debris, squeezed into dangerous spaces, and searched relentlessly for signs of life. Their training allowed them to detect human scent, even in conditions where technology often failed. As days passed, hopes of finding survivors faded, but the dogs continued working. Many handlers later reported that the animals seemed confused when they found so few living people. To maintain morale and reinforce their training, rescuers sometimes staged finds, hiding volunteers for the dogs to locate. The recovery effort at Ground Zero lasted for months. The dogs became symbols of courage, endurance, and service during one of the darkest moments in American history. Their work helped bring answers to families and supported the enormous recovery operation. Today, the story of the 9/11 rescue dogs remains a powerful reminder that heroism takes many forms. In the face of unimaginable tragedy, they worked beside firefighters, police officers, and volunteers, proving that even amid devastation, loyalty and hope can endure.